Welcome to the audiobook of Conjectures and Refutations by Karl Popper, narrated by Elyse Hargreaves with the consent of the University of Klagenfurt, Karl Popper Library. Chapter 7: Kant's Critique and Cosmology. 150 years ago, Immanuel Kant died, having spent the 80 years of his life in the Prussian provincial town of Königsberg. For years, his retirement had been complete, and his friends intended a quiet burial. But this son of an artisan was buried like a king. When the rumor of his death spread through the town, the people flocked to his house, demanding to see him. On the day of the funeral, the life of the town was at a standstill. The coffin was followed by thousands, while the bells of all the churches tolled. Nothing like this had ever before happened in Königsberg, say the chroniclers. It is difficult to account for this astonishing upsurge of popular feeling. Was it due solely to Kant's reputation as a great philosopher and a good man? It seems to me that there was more in it than this, and I suggest that in the year 1804, under the absolute monarchy of Frederick William, those bells tolling for Kant carried an echo of the American and French revolutions, of the ideas of 1776 and 1789. I suggest that to his countrymen, Kant had become an embodiment of these ideas. They came to show their gratitude to a teacher of the rights of man, of equality before the law, of world citizenship, of peace on earth, and perhaps, most important, of emancipation through knowledge. 1. Kant and the Enlightenment. Most of these ideas had reached the continent from England through a book published in 1733, Voltaire's Letters Concerning the English Nation. In this book, Voltaire contrasts English constitutional government with continental absolute monarchy, English religious toleration with the attitude of the Roman Church, and the explanatory power of Newton's cosmology and of Locke's analytic empiricism with the dogmatism of Descartes. Voltaire's book was burnt, but its publication marks the beginning of a philosophical movement, a movement whose peculiar mood of intellectual aggressiveness was little understood in England, where there was no occasion for it. 60 years after Kant's death, these same English ideas were being presented to the English as a shallow and pretentious intellectualism, and ironically enough, the English word Enlightenment, which was then used to name the movement started by Voltaire, is still beset by this connotation of shallowness and pretentiousness. This, at least, is what the Oxford English Dictionary tells us. I need hardly add that no such connotation is intended when I use the word enlightenment. Kant believed in the Enlightenment. He was its last great defender. I realize that this is not the usual view. While I see Kant as the defender of the Enlightenment, he is more often taken as the founder of the school which destroyed it, of the Romantic school of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. I contend that these two interpretations are incompatible. Fichte, and later Hegel, tried to appropriate Kant as the founder of their school, but Kant lived long enough to reject the persistent advances of Fichte, who proclaimed himself Kant's successor and heir. In a public declaration concerning Fichte, which is too little known, Kant wrote, "May God protect us from our friends, for there are fraudulent and perfidious so-called friends who are scheming for our ruin while speaking the language of goodwill." It was only after Kant's death, when he could no longer protest, that this world citizen was successfully pressed into the service of the nationalistic Romantic school, in spite of all his warnings against romanticism, sentimental enthusiasm, and Schwärmerei. But let us see how Kant himself describes the idea of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment is the emancipation of man from a state of self-imposed tutelage, of incapacity to use his own intelligence without external guidance. Such a state of tutelage I call self-imposed, if it is due not to lack of intelligence, but to lack of courage or determination to use one's own intelligence without the help of a leader. Sapere aude, dare to use your own intelligence. This is the battle cry of the Enlightenment. Kant is saying something very personal here. It is part of his own history. Brought up in near poverty, in the narrow outlook of pietism, a severe German version of Puritanism, his own life was a story of emancipation through knowledge. In later years, he used to look back with horror to what he called the slavery of childhood, his period of tutelage. One might well say that the dominant theme of his whole life was the struggle for spiritual freedom. 2. Kant's Newtonian cosmology. A decisive role in this struggle was played by Newton's theory, which had been made known on the continent by Voltaire. The cosmology of Copernicus and Newton became the powerful and exciting inspiration of Kant's intellectual life. His first important book, The Theory of the Heavens, has the interesting subtitle, An Essay on the Constitution and the Mechanical Origin of the Universe, treated according to Newtonian principles. It is one of the greatest contributions ever made to cosmology and cosmogony. It contains the first formulation, not only of what is now called the Kant-Laplace hypotheses of the origin of the solar system, but also, anticipating genes, an application of this idea to the Milky Way, which Thomas Wright had interpreted as a stellar system 5 years earlier. But all this is excelled by Kant's identification of the nebula as other Milky Ways, distant stellar systems similar to our own. It was the cosmological problem, as Kant explains in one of his letters, which led him to his theory of knowledge and to his critique of pure reason. He was concerned with the knotty problem, which has to be faced by every cosmologist, of the finitude or infinity of the universe, with respect to both space and time. As far as space is concerned, a fascinating solution has been suggested since, by Einstein, in the form of a world which is both finite and without limits. This solution cuts right through the Kantian knot, but it uses more powerful means than those available to Kant and his contemporaries. As far as time is concerned, no equally promising solution of Kant's difficulties has been offered up to now. 3. The critique and the cosmological problem. Kant tells us that he came upon the central problem of his critique when considering whether the universe had a beginning in time or not. He found, to his dismay, that he could produce seemingly valid proofs for both of these possibilities. The two proofs are interesting. It needs concentration to follow them, but they are not long and not hard to understand. For the first proof, we start by analysing the idea of an infinite sequence of years, or days, or any other equal and finite intervals of time. Such an infinite sequence of years must be a sequence which goes on and never comes to an end. It can never be completed. A completed or an elapsed infinity of years is a contradiction in terms. Now, in his first proof, Kant simply argues that the world must have a beginning in time, since otherwise, at this present moment, an infinite number of years must have elapsed, which is impossible. This concludes his first proof. For the second proof, we start by analysing the idea of a completely empty time, the time before there was a world. Such an empty time, in which there is nothing whatever, must be a time none of whose time intervals is differentiated from any other by its temporal relation to things and events, since things and events simply do not exist at all. Now, take the last interval of the empty time, the one immediately before the world begins. Clearly, this interval is differentiated from all earlier intervals, since it is characterized by its close temporal relation to an event, the beginning of the world. Yet, the same interval is supposed to be empty, which is a contradiction in terms. Now, in his second proof, Kant simply argues that the world cannot have a beginning in time, since otherwise there would be a time interval, the moment immediately before the world began, which is empty, and yet characterized by its immediate temporal relation to an event in the world, which is impossible. We have here a clash between two proofs. Such a clash Kant called an antinomy. I shall not trouble you with the other antinomies in which Kant found himself entangled, such as those concerning the limits of the universe in space. 4. Space and time. What lesson did Kant draw from these bewildering antinomies? He concluded that our ideas of space and time are inapplicable to the universe as a whole. We can, of course, apply the ideas of space and time to ordinary physical things and physical events, but space and time themselves are neither things nor events. They cannot even be observed. They are more elusive. They are a kind of framework for things and events, something like a system of pigeonholes or a filing system for observations. Space and time are not part of the real empirical world of things and events, but rather part of our mental outfit, our apparatus for grasping this world. Their proper use is as instruments of observation. In observing any event, we locate it, as a rule, immediately and intuitively in an order of space and time. Thus, space and time may be described as a frame of reference, which is not based upon experience, but intuitively used in experience, and properly applicable to experience. This is why we get into trouble if we misapply the ideas of space and time by using them in a field which transcends all possible experience, as we did in our two proofs about the universe as a whole. To the view which I have just outlined, Kant chose to give the ugly and doubly misleading name Transcendental Idealism. He soon regretted his choice, for it made people believe that he was an idealist in the sense of denying the reality of physical things, that he declared physical things to be mere ideas. Kant hastened to explain that he had only denied that space and time are empirical and real in the sense in which physical things and events are empirical and real. But in vain did he protest. His difficult style sealed his fate. He was to be revered as the father of German idealism. I suggest that it is time to put this right. Kant always insisted that the physical things in space and time are real. And as to the wild and obscure metaphysical speculations of the German idealists, the very title of Kant's critique was chosen to announce a critical attack upon all such speculative reasoning. For what the critique criticizes is pure reason. It criticizes and attacks all reasoning about the world that is pure, in the sense of being untainted by sense experience. Kant attacked pure reason by showing that pure reasoning about the world must always entangle us in antinomies. Stimulated by Hume, Kant wrote his critique in order to establish that the limits of sense experience are the limits of all sound reasoning about the world. 5. Kant's Copernican Revolution. Kant's faith in his theory of space and time as an intuitive frame of reference was confirmed when he found in it a key to the solution of a second problem. This was the problem of the validity of Newtonian theory in whose absolute and unquestionable truth he believed, in common with all contemporary physicists. It was inconceivable, he felt, that this exact mathematical theory should be nothing but the result of accumulated observations. But what else could be its basis? Kant approached this problem by first considering the status of geometry. Euclid's geometry is not based upon observation, he said, but upon our intuition of spatial relations. Newtonian science is in a similar position. Although confirmed by observation, it is the result not of these observations, but of our own ways of thinking, of our attempts to order our sense data, to understand them, and to digest them intellectually. It is not these sense data, but our own intellect, the organization of the digestive system of our mind, which is responsible for our theories. Nature as we know it, with its order and with its laws, is thus largely a product of the assimilating and ordering activities of our own mind. In Kant's own striking formulation of this view, our intellect does not draw its laws from nature, but imposes its laws upon nature. This formula sums up an idea which Kant himself proudly calls his Copernican revolution. As Kant puts it, Copernicus, finding that no progress was being made with the theory of the revolving heavens, broke the deadlock by turning the tables, as it were. He assumed that it is not the heavens which revolve while the observers stand still, but that we, the observers, revolve while the heavens stand still. In a similar way, Kant says, the problem of scientific knowledge is to be solved. The problem how an exact science, such as Newtonian theory, is possible, and how it could ever have been found. We must give up the view that we are passive observers, waiting for nature to impress its regularity upon us. Instead, we must adopt the view that in digesting our sense data, we actively impress the order and the laws of our intellect upon them. Our cosmos bears the imprint of our minds. By emphasizing the role played by the observer, the investigator, the theorist, Kant made an indelible impression not only upon philosophy, but also upon physics and cosmology. There is a Kantian climate of thought without which Einstein's theories, or Bohr's, are hardly conceivable. And Eddington might be said to be more of a Kantian, in some respects, than Kant himself. Even those who, like myself, cannot follow Kant all the way, can accept his view that the experimenter must not wait till it pleases nature to reveal her secrets, but that he must question her. He must cross-examine nature in the light of his doubts, his conjectures, his theories, his ideas, and his inspirations. Here, I believe, is a wonderful philosophical find. It makes it possible to look upon science, whether theoretical or experimental, as a human creation, and to look upon its history as part of the history of ideas, on a level with the history of art or of literature. There is a second and even more interesting meaning inherent in Kant's version of the Copernican revolution, a meaning which may perhaps indicate an ambivalence in his attitude towards it. For Kant's Copernican revolution solves a human problem to which Copernicus's own revolution gave rise. Copernicus deprived man of his central position in the physical universe. Kant's Copernican revolution takes the sting out of this. He shows us not only that our location in the physical universe is irrelevant, but also that in a sense, our universe may well be said to turn about us, for it is we who produce, at least in part, the order we find in it. It is we who create our knowledge of it. We are discoverers, and discovery is a creative art. 6. the doctrine of autonomy. From Kant, the cosmologist, the philosopher of knowledge and of science, I now turn to Kant, the moralist. I do not know whether it has been noticed before that the fundamental idea of Kant's ethics amounts to another Copernican revolution, analogous in every respect to the one I have described. For Kant makes man the lawgiver of morality, just as he makes man the lawgiver of nature. And in doing so, he gives back to man his central place, both in his moral and in his physical universe. Kant humanized ethics as he had humanized science. Kant's Copernican revolution in the field of ethics is contained in his doctrine of autonomy, the doctrine that we cannot accept the command of an authority, however exalted, as the ultimate basis of ethics. For whenever we are faced with a command by an authority, it is our responsibility to judge whether this command is moral or immoral. The authority may have the power to enforce its commands, and we may be powerless to resist. But unless we are physically prevented from choosing, the responsibility remains ours. It is our decision whether to obey a command, whether to accept authority. Kant boldly carries this revolution into the field of religion. Here is a striking passage. Much as my words may startle you, you must not condemn me for saying, every man creates his God. From the moral point of view, you even have to create your God in order to worship in him your Creator. For in whatever way, the deity should be made known to you, and even if he should reveal himself to you, it is you who must judge whether you are permitted by your conscience to believe in him and to worship him. Kant's ethical theory is not confined to the statement that a man's conscience is his moral authority. He also tries to tell us what our conscience may demand from us. Of this, the moral law, he gives several formulations. One of them is, always regard every man as an end in himself, and never use him merely as means to your ends. The spirit of Kant's ethics may well be summed up in these words: dare to be free, and respect the freedom of others. Upon the basis of these ethics, Kant erected his most important theory of the state, and his theory of international law. He demanded a League of Nations, or a federal union of states, which ultimately was to proclaim and to maintain eternal peace on earth. I have tried to sketch in broad outline Kant's philosophy of man and his world, and its two main inspirations, Newtonian cosmology and the ethics of freedom, the two inspirations to which Kant referred when he spoke of the starry heavens above us and the moral law within us. Stepping back further to get a still more distant view of Kant's historical role, we may compare him with Socrates. Both were accused of perverting the state religion and of corrupting the minds of the young. Both denied the charge, and both stood up for freedom of thought. Freedom meant more to them than absence of constraint. It was for both a way of life. From Socrates' apology and from his death, there sprung a new idea of a free man, the idea of a man whose spirit cannot be subdued, of a man who is free because he is self-sufficient, who is not in need of constraint because he is able to rule himself and to accept freely the rule of law. To this Socratic idea of self-sufficiency, which forms part of our Western heritage, Kant has given a new meaning in the fields of both knowledge and morals. He has added to it further the idea of a community of free men, of all men, for he has shown that every man is free, not because he is born free, but because he is born with the burden of responsibility for free decision.